Bad start to the evening. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wyn Bowen, head of the school for the School of Security Studies. Can everybody hear me in the back? It's very difficult for me to hear whether or not you can hear me or not. Okay, I'll just keep on going. So as I say, welcome to King's College London and to the inauguration of the King's Wargaming Network. The School of Security Studies here at King's has identified wargaming as a priority area for us in line with King's Vision 2029, which some of you will be aware of. With the goals of advancing and democratizing wargaming education, developing wargaming as an academic discipline, and applying wargaming to generate and deliver big ideas in service to society. And our new wargaming network builds on, as you know, a rich history of King's gaming activities, and we hope it will serve as a hub for the growing community of King's students and staff that study, research, and apply games and simulations. And the network, as we evolve, is going to seek to engage and convene world-class gaming scholars, practitioners, and emerging talent in the field. Professor Phil Sabin here on my right and Ivanka Barzashka down there in the front row will serve as co-directors of the network, and it'll be open to King's students, academic and research staff that are interested in advancing wargaming as a method of inquiry and also as a method for learning and for teaching. Tonight, the Wargaming Network is launching a new public lecture series as well at the same time. And in this academic year, 2018-19, lectures will examine fundamental challenges for adapting wargaming theory and practice to usefully address contemporary security problems facing the UK and its NATO allies. Government officials, think tank experts and academics have revived their interest in wargaming to understand the requirements for modern deterrence, defence and security, and to adapt strategy, doctrine and capability in the new era of strategic competition. In 2017, the US government invested just over $500 million in a 5-year programme to, in quotes, reinvigorate wargaming. The UK is following suit, perhaps not with the $500 million, but we've seen the publication of a wargaming handbook in 2017. We've seen the establishment of a new wargaming centre of excellence in the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, and then the new Office of Strategic Net Assessment in the MOD, it'll also employ wargaming techniques. Wargaming can usefully supplement the broader analytical toolkit and stimulate innovation in the field of defence and security, can also foster individual and collective learning and strengthen stakeholder engagement. Yet there are important theoretical and practical challenges to the rigorous application of wargaming to usefully address consequential national and international security questions. And this is what this year's lecture series, as I said, aims to address. King's is currently the leading centre for civilian wargaming research and education, we believe, and we have a rich history of activities in this respect. Prominent examples would include the Department of War Studies offering, since 2003, a full-year conflict simulation taught at the master's level in a 2-term module convened by Professor Sabin here. And this is very much unique to King's. And Phil also employs wargames in teaching the history of warfare at the bachelor's level too. Since 2013, War Studies has co-organised with DSTL and the UK Defence Academy the premier annual European Professional Wargaming Conference, UK Connections. Since 2015, Ivanka, on my right here too, has led the development of a new strategic gaming method and directed a series of high-profile gaming events at the UK Defence Academy as part of a 3-year King's project, with myself, I should add, on understanding the impact of missile defence on nuclear deterrence and stability, funded under a competitive funding competition by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. In 2018, Dr. Aggie Hurst, one of our colleagues in the War Studies, won a British Academy Fellowship for a project on the pedagogy of play, and is writing an OUP book coming out of that. And more recently, Dr. Heather Williams and Professor Lawrence Friedman were awarded a 1-year DoD grant to research the impact of social media on nuclear signalling and escalation, and which includes a wargaming component too. I would add at the end that my colleague Matthew Moran and myself are engaged in a project looking at coercion around chemical weapons use in Syria, an empirical research project, and from that we have built a tabletop exercise from that too. So there's a lot of activity going on, I think, across King's relevant to today. So this evening we're very fortunate indeed to have Peter Perla joining us to give our inaugural lecture on the art and science of wargaming to innovate and educate in an era of strategic competition. This event's being live streamed, so it's all on the record, so be careful what you say or ask or do. Please enjoy the evening, and if you don't already interact with Kings in this sphere, then please do make contact tonight or in due course. It'd be great to hear from people that we don't already know. And at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague Ivanka Barzashka, who's going to more formally introduce Peter. Good.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct honor to present the inaugural King's Lecture on Wargaming to mark the establishment of the new King's Wargaming Network, a research network that seeks to advance the theory and practice of wargaming to innovate and educate. We are honored to have Dr. Peter Perla, who has dedicated his career to advancing the theory and practice of wargaming, lead this evening's conversation. While launching on a new research venture is a moment of intellectual excitement, it's also a reflection of intellectual humility at a strategic inflection point. We established the Wargaming Network in recognition that we need better tools for understanding the changed and changing logic of the new strategic era, an era that's marked by the return of major power rivalry. We need better tools to understand and prepare for future conflicts involving major powers in order to deter them, conflicts in which innovation through experimentation on the battlefield will be too costly. So this need for innovation has revived the interest in wargaming, which has been practiced more as an art than a science by a small expert community and mostly in classified military environments. But while wargaming holds analytical potential, there are challenges to producing reliable knowledge through wargaming about vital national security questions. And while the value of wargaming as a method for learning and teaching is well accepted, its value as a rigorous academic method of inquiry is still largely contested. This new strategic problem set has brought wargaming into the limelight, and this is why we at King's are bringing into the limelight the discussion on adapting our analytical tools with the first public lecture series on wargaming. So we begin at the foundation, the challenges of epistemology. What can we know through wargaming? How can we know? We conceived the first wargaming lecture around three sets of questions. First, why has wargaming to date been practiced more as an art than a science? Second, does wargaming require a more scientific approach to usefully address contemporary security questions? Third, can we reconcile the diverging epistemological views to reap the benefits of wargaming as both an art and a science? We are delighted to have Dr. Peter Perla address these questions this evening. Among the professional wargaming community, Dr. Perla needs no introduction. He's one of the preeminent experts on the theory and application of wargaming who has served as a mentor to many wargaming practitioners. He's the author of The Art of Wargaming, first published in 1990, back in the day when the topic wasn't as popular as it is today. And in 2017, Dr. Perla received an award for lifetime achievement in wargaming, and this was the first award of its kind presented by the U.S. Connections Wargaming Conference. He served for over 40 years as a research scientist at the Center for Naval Analyses, a U.S. government think tank, and his contributions are valued by his colleagues at CNA, who are now hosting a watch party for him, joining us from Arlington, Virginia today via our live stream on YouTube. But we didn't invite Dr. Perla as our first speaker because of his reputation. We invited him because he brings deep insights to the question of how can we develop the best tools to address the most complex security problems facing our societies. And so it's perhaps best to introduce Dr. Perla with his own words. He wrote, "This high-level interest in wargaming may be new, but serious professional wargaming has been practiced for nearly 200 years. Sometimes it has pointed the way towards success. Too often, it has been oversold by charlatans, abused by the cynical, and ignored by those who need to learn from the insights it can provide. Today, we face a critical historic inflection point. We cannot afford to mess up this opportunity. It's time to get wargaming right. It's too important not to."
Thank you, Ivanka. I was surprised at that quotation, which caused me a certain amount of difficulty at the Defense Department when I wrote it. I'm very honored to be here tonight to kick off this very important King's College London initiative. And I was extremely pleased when Ivanka and Aggie Hurst and Phil Sabin invited me to speak here tonight. It's an important topic. I hope I can do it some justice. But to be clear, before I start, the words here are mine, although I have drawn on other people's words and thoughts. But I am not representing this as an official presentation of the Center for Naval Analyses or the Department of Defense or any other persons or organizations. Now, Ivanka has set me quite a challenge to address the broad subject of the art and science of wargaming. This is a complex topic, so let me get right to it, if I can actually work the buttons. So, this is the question, the basic question that Ivanka asked. Is wargaming an art or a science? Well, yes. I'm sure you probably guessed that one was coming. Of course, it's both. And I hope during this presentation that I can help you understand why this is in fact the case. This is an outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I want this conversation to flow, so I'm hoping to go relatively short so that we have time for conversation amongst ourselves. I'll start with an overview of the nature and evolution of wargames, leading to some words about the reinvigoration in the Department of Defense in the US, as has been mentioned. Then I'll get to the heart of my story and talk about validity in wargaming. What makes any wargame a valid source of knowledge and understanding? Then I'll talk about what and whom wargames should teach and how we need to integrate wargaming with our other tools to address the future, and in particular, the need to grow future wargamers as those of us who have been, shall we say, involved in the battle for a long time and are getting old and gray and have pretty much lost our combat effectiveness, retired from the field, we need a new generation to take over. Because the new generation is going to be the critical source for wargaming in the future. Then I'll end up with a little bit of a messianic message. Why you should care about all this. Why do wargames matter? First, let me talk about what a wargame is. And here's just some brief examples for those of you who may not be too familiar with this subject. Wargames take many forms. From the bogsat, or the bunch of guys sitting around the table talking, to a tabletop game with miniatures, or for the uninitiated, or the muggles as we call them, toy soldiers. to the classic hex and counter board game, to computer games, especially those making use of table technology, which is beginning to combine the best and maybe the worst in some cases of both computer games and board games. What all of these myriad forms of war games have in common is this. People have to make decisions in a competitive environment, and they have to live with the consequences of those decisions in that environment. That's what the war games are all about. So whenever you have that situation, you have, in essence, a war game. Now, over the past several hundred years, 200 some, war games, like most things, have evolved. Ancient games like chess and Go were designed to teach particularly nobles the essence of strategy. They were abstract. They focused on what was important to think about when you were facing an opponent who is trying to defeat you. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, a Prussian artillery lieutenant named von Reiswitz created what we call today the father of war games, the Kriegsspiel. It evolved out of a long tradition, but this was something new. It was based on wartime experience in the wars against Napoleon, as well as on test data taken from the Prussian field tests. Von Reiswitz created a game system and a set of tables and data that, in essence, were a simulation. In fact, the chief of the Prussian General Staff, when he was shown this tool, declared it not a game at all, but rather a training for war. In the interim, from 1824 or so, up until around 1870, other people took the game and began a process of analysis and modeling that in many ways continues to today. They created more and more complex situations and rules and data, so much so that the game became almost unplayable. As a result, another Prussian, Julius von Verdi du Vernois, created what he called the free Kriegsspiel. The simulation evolved into a story because the free Kriegsspiel was managed not by tables and data, but by experienced officers who had been through the Franco-Prussian War and were able to present the results of the actions of the game in the form of tactical stories that the players would have to live through. So wargaming evolved from abstraction to simulation, from simulation to story, and in some cases, back again to simulation. All the major powers used some form of wargaming during the period from World War I to World War II, even before. But World War II was a kind of a watershed, because operations research, as we know it today, came into existence with a power in the Second World War, and systems analysis followed soon after. Operations research was defined by one of its founding documents, Morse and Kimball's Methods of Operations Research, in the terms here: as a scientific method of providing decision makers with a quantitative basis for decisions. The key words here are scientific and quantitative. The key words in wargames are people and decisions. There's differences there. But after World War II, the wargames' ability to contribute to the Defense Department's decision-making process was largely overshadowed by operations research and systems analysis. This was the case pretty much across the board, but especially in procurement. The ORSA community began replacing the military judgment that had dominated the War Department and the Navy Department before they became the Defense Department. And it was replaced with ORSA. So the validity of military judgment and wargaming was called into question and replaced by the validity created by ORSA. So the wargaming community was used to a sinusoidal cycle of popularity and unpopularity. And that had gone on since the end of World War II. In 2014 and early 2015, a series of memos from the Department of Defense, from the Secretary himself, as well as from his deputy, triggered what they called a reinvigoration of wargaming. They wanted to use wargaming to assess the current and future plans, to question existing concepts, to stimulate innovation and new ideas, and develop new concepts of operations, all of which could take place in a risk-friendly environment where you could make a stupid decision and get your head handed to you, but nobody would really care. Well, maybe not. That was the theory anyway. And all of this was designed to help the department develop what they called the third offset strategy. The first offset was massive retaliation in the 50s. The second offset was the development of enhanced conventional capabilities, in particular precision-guided munitions. And now the department was looking for a new way of dealing with our major potential and real major opponents, a third way of offsetting them. And they looked to wargames to inspire the innovation that they needed to come up with these kinds of solutions. Not surprisingly, there was a bureaucratic response. Whoa. New processes and organizations were created. The DWAG, Defense Wargaming Alignment Group, consisted of senior officials whose job it was to serve as a bridge between the wargaming community and the senior leadership of the department. The idea was to communicate to the wargamers what the leaders were most interested in, and to tell the leaders what the wargamers were up to. To manage that process, they created the Wargame Incentive Fund. This fund is currently providing up to $10 million a year to fund specific wargames and wargame-related research. That's just a tiny bit of the billions of dollars that Wynn mentioned earlier that are being spent on other wargaming activities within the department. This is sort of the seed money. To provide a framework for managing both the communications with the DWAG and the money, they created a wargame repository where the wargamers were supposed to provide data and input about what the wargames were, how they were designed, what they dealt with, what the results were, so that the senior leaders could go in and look and say, oh, somebody's going to have a game on the Crisis in Ukraine. Maybe I should go to that. That was the theory. Practice has not been quite that good, but they're trying. But there was also pushback from the other direction. Particularly, there was tension with the modeling and simulation, or ModSim community within the US. Lots of money in modeling and simulation. And some of the contractors and gurus of modeling and simulation were not pleased to see money funneled off to wargames. So they generally push back in one of, or both of two ways. First, well, we can do wargames. We've always done wargames. We know exactly what wargames are. Even though, for the most part, they didn't really know how to spell wargames. Wargaming, by the way, is one word, not two, not hyphenated. The second pushback came with the complaints about the validity, the reliability of wargames. How can you put your trust in a game played by a handful of people off in a corner somewhere? So that brings me to the heart of my story. I want to talk about the concept of validity from several different directions. First, let's go with science. Mathematics and science, physical science, are judged on their ability to use data and information to predict the course and outcome of future physical events. If you have a scientific theory that there will be gravity waves, and nobody ever sees a gravity wave, you start getting a little bit shaky. And when one shows up, now maybe you're onto something. Unfortunately, for the OR people, there were no real wars during that time in particular, right after the war, World War II. There were no real wars to take data from to do analysis. So what happened was they developed mathematical models, and they used the models to generate the data to do the analysis. Well, the models are based on mathematical principles. And so the rules of mathematics drive whether the model is valid or not. Now let's look at social science. I am not a social scientist. Fair warning, what I am is a statistician. So I'm skeptical about just about anything, especially with numbers. So I went to a source online from the social science community to try to understand how they view validity. And these are the three elements that I found. First, there's internal validity. This means that the instrument, like a survey question, measures what it is actually intended to measure. Sure, we've all seen survey questions and just kind of shake your head and go, well, what are they trying to get out of that? So that's an important element. I'm really measuring what I want. The second type of validity is external validity. And this means that the results of the experiment or the study can be generalized. They will apply to other cases, other tests, other groups. Finally, there's true validity. Now, we're really getting into, we've got validity, and like a true validity, social science. True validity means that not only are the results measuring what they intend to, they're generalizable, but they're repeatable. That I can do another study, another survey, and I will get similar results. So to the extent that war games make use of math and science, they have to follow the rules of math and science. To the extent war games make use of social science tools, they should follow some of the rules of social science. And typically the validity, the internal and external validity, are pretty solid. But the true validity, the repeatable results, that's a bit vexing for war games. A war game is repeatable. I can play it again. What I can't do is replicate it. I can't repeat it with the same people because the people that have played it before are no longer the same. They've played the game. They're changed. So it's tricky. It's tricky. So now let's turn to art and our own personal experience. How can fiction or graphic art tell us something true? How can my experience be valid, especially for you? So I turned again to the internet, and I found an interesting field that I had never heard of before, called arts-based research. And so what I did was I went looking, and I'm going to read this because it's an extract from the eponymous book by Tom Barone and Elliot Eisner. These are the key points for my purposes. The arts typically project an image that reshapes our conception of some aspects of the world, or that sheds light on aspects of the world we had not seen before. And to be useful, a piece of arts-based research must succeed both as a work of art and as a work of research. It must be, that is, of sufficiently high quality to lead members of its audience into a powerful experience, into a researching of social phenomena. So to me, I think war games fall dead into this area. It seems to me like a war game is valid if it can reshape our conception or shed light on things we had not seen before. If it leads to a powerful experience that drives its audience to do serious research about critical phenomena. It's art-based research, art plus science. Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling made this famous statement: you can't make a list of things you never thought of. The compelling experience that war games need to make is to help us think of things we never thought of. And war games can do that very effectively because they teach us this set of stuff. What we really know, not just facts, but understanding of what those facts mean. It's easy to tell somebody that it's going to be 15 seconds from the time the missile clears the horizon of the radar until it impacts your ship. That seems understandable until you actually experience it in a game. That's really, really fast. They teach us what we don't know. I learned a lot about tank and anti-tank combat from playing games. Penetration, angles of armor. I didn't know any of that stuff until I played games. Then they teach us what we don't know we know. Okay, now that sounds weird, doesn't it? How can you not know what you know? My favorite story along these lines came from a U.S. Army colonel at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He had reported to the college after a tour in Iraq. He took his students on a walking tour of the town. When he got them back to class, he sat them down and he said, okay, what were the flowers planted in front of the City Hall? Well, you can imagine I've got some majors and lieutenant colonels, maybe a smattering of captains in the Army. Flowers in front of City Hall? One guy puts his hand up. Oh yeah, they were petunias. And everybody else looks at him like, well, how did you know that? Oh, well, my parents were botanists, so I grew up with flowers. I know all about flowers. There were a bunch of other stories too, but I won't spend time on them because they all point to the same thing. What the colonel was trying to do was show that class that as a whole, they knew more than they knew they knew. And that was important in the situation in Iraq, where the fact that one guy might see a change in the environment that nobody else noticed, and that could be the difference between life and death. So war games can help us understand what we didn't know that we actually know. And then there's the one that I coined a long time before a U.S. Secretary of Defense, whose name will go unmentioned. War games teach us what we don't know we don't know. This is an important thing, which I learned again in my youth playing games. I played a game on the Battle of Midway. I didn't know anything about how can I put it? Attack tactics against aircraft carriers. Air attack tactics against aircraft carriers. I didn't even know there were fancy tactics. When I played this game, I learned that there was something called an anvil attack. You attack from the side, you attack from the bow with torpedoes, and the ship's got a problem because no matter which way it turns, it's going to be struck in the side. I didn't know that, and now I did. But perhaps most importantly is the last one. War games help us learn what we know that ain't so. This was a favorite phrase of Abraham Lincoln, which he actually got from one of his favorite authors. It's not what you don't know that will kill you. It's what you know that ain't so. And in peacetime, we know way too much that may not really be so. And so when you get a chance to learn which facts are really fables, you've got to take that opportunity. Well, whom should war games teach these things? We need to teach better decision makers to make better decisions. War games can help them turn facts into understanding. It can help create synthetic experience in dealing with complex and uncertain situations. Situations that call for a special brand of thinking. A German psychologist named Dietrich Dorner coined the phrase, thinking about shapes in time, about applying common sense in unusual, uncertain, and particularly time-pressured situations. War games can do that very well. And in so doing, they can make theoretical risks tangible. One of the examples my colleague Ed McGrady and I used in a paper that we wrote about the subject of war games was a case of the Shoemaker-Levy comet, which struck the planet Jupiter. I can't remember the dates. There was a debate in the US Congress at the time about funding planetary defense. Okay, science fiction stuff. It was kind of right near the time that the Independence Day movie came out with the big bad aliens attacking. So there was this debate about, well, should we invest in planetary defense to knock down, not necessarily aliens, but things like comets? Well, there was not a lot of debate about that, and nobody really got it. And then the video of the comet striking the planet, Jupiter, hit the streets. Suddenly, people got it. Most war games aren't as dramatic as a comet hitting a planet. But they can make theoretical risks tangible when a political leader playing in a game suddenly realizes that, oh my God, if I get a weapon of mass destruction going off in downtown Arlington in Virginia next to DC, I'm going to have some real problems dealing with that. It's not just a theory anymore because he actually has to deal with it in the context of the game. So that's decision makers. But war games are important to analysts as well. Because war games can help analysts disprove old hypotheses. This is a classic element of physical science. If your theory cannot be disproved, is not capable of being disproved, it's not very useful because we'll never know if it's right or not. But if I can disprove it, I've got some positive learning there. So when we have these bright ideas that we put into a war game and the opponent comes up with a solution, that's important to learn. Phil was talking earlier this evening about a classic case of the military exercises where they develop a plan and they were waiting to see the enemy react the way they expected, and they didn't react. And they didn't react. And then they came up the rear of the force and gave them a drubbing. The other thing that games can do is help analysts develop new hypotheses. Hypotheses that they can test using other tools. I saw this in action in the US in the 80s, where we had an idea to deploy aircraft carriers into the fjords of Norway. And the question was, is that sensible? Does that make any sense at all? And so what happened was, we did analysis, we ran a game, took the fleet to Norway, came back, did more analysis, and did more games. In other words, the cycle of research. All of the tools that we use to study security matters try to look at pretty much the whole picture. But they each look at part of that picture more clearly than the other tools. Analysis looks at the physical reality. It's the basis of everything, but it's not everything. War games look at people making decisions when they're faced with that physical reality. Exercises and experiments really look at how well other people and machines can carry out those decisions. But we really only understand the range of real outcomes when we have practical experience of real combat, whether it's historical or current. All of those pieces need to work together to feed each other, the way my little process with the carriers in Norway worked. One piece feeding the other, feeding the next, moving along. It's the cycle of research that can make wargaming an important part of a partnership of tools. Not just the dominant tool, not like OR or modeling and simulation or anything else. They all have to work together. And so we need to grow that next generation of gamers. That means we need to encourage students to study gaming. Professor Sabin's classes, and Ivanka's work, and Aggie's work are trying to do that. We're trying to bring new blood into gaming. We've got some programs we're trying to start in the US to get some academic programs specifically in wargaming, not in computer games or entertainment games. But the military and security communities really need to create some professional programs to teach the next generation of civilian and uniformed leaders how to do or consume or interpret wargames. And finally, we need senior leaders to lead. And here's my signature 3 Ps. First, they need to permit the people on their staffs to play wargames. If wargames are looked down on and talked as if they were childish toys, professionals aren't going to want to get involved in them. They need permission to play. Then they need to promote people that are experts at designing, creating, understanding, analyzing, and applying games so that they can take advantage of their talents in situations and places where you can leverage them the best. And finally, senior leaders need to play because they need to see the power of the games for themselves. They need to understand how they can contribute their own parts of the story to the game and how they can learn from the game and teach people in the game and how to take the game's results to heart, to actually do something important based not on the game's results, not on the game's models, but on the insights that they get from playing those games, from the lessons that they learn, the things that they hadn't thought of. Senior leaders will not really take on board results of games that don't agree with their preconceived notions unless they themselves have experienced the power. So now we get to the so what question. Why should you care about this? Why should you care about war games at all? Fun to play, get to roll dice, move pieces around, kill bad guys. I'm going to cover that for a second. The very first Connections UK conference, during one of the breaks, I had a conversation with Charles Vasey, who is a UK commercial hobby wargamer and game designer. And Charles, as is his wont, asked me, "You seen the Muppet movie?" No, actually I haven't. Well, seeing a Muppet movie, there's a scene where Kermit the Frog walks into a bar. And he's confronted with a guy, big guy. And the guy comes up to him and he says, "My name is Snake. I eat frogs." Charles thought, we wargamers need to have some nice, powerful, simple statements like that to use as, in a sense, marketing tools to help people understand why games are important and what they're good at. And I was impressed. He had these 3 statements, and it was great. I wrote them down, and I lost it. So I asked him, and he couldn't remember either. But we did remember the first one. And I've made up something similar to the other 2. And these are they. War games entertain. They stir the imagination. War games educate. They inform the intellect. War games engage. They stimulate the intuition. And most of all, war games save lives. That's why they matter. Now, questions and comments. Over to you. No, it's okay. It looks like I went longer than I expected. Sorry.
So at this stage, we'll take questions or comments from the audience. And remember, the questions are on the record. Please introduce yourselves.
Yes. Sorry, thank you. It's a superb presentation. My name's Ian Mitchell. I'm the head of modelling integrity in a government department, so your points on validity seem very apt. I was struck that a lot of what you said resonates with my experience having managed war games as an analytical tool previously, and the need for the client to actually experience for themselves what the analysts have often seen. I remember having to employ a client effectively for 3 weeks as unpaid labour so he could see why we had said what we said, and his reaction of, "Oh, it's the ground." And I thought, yes, that's what we said 6 months ago, but he had to see it for himself. Given the challenges of time, do you see a potential with the new technologies of these things, mobile phones, which can connect you to virtual communities pretty much at whim, as offering other gateways for such players to be able to see without having to disappear to the wilds of Kent or elsewhere in order to get that immersive experience?
Right, yeah, I think there are a couple of possibilities there. One is that they can at least plug into maybe daily or end-of-game presentations, but that's not that much different from getting the briefing in person. One of the things that I've thought about for a while, but I haven't been able to pursue, and maybe some of these young hotshot programmer types like Colin could do it, and that is to take a game that was played by a bunch of people over a period of several days or a week and condense it into a computerized form that hits the key decisions that the players made in the game, and then have that given to the senior leader for him to explore in the privacy of his office, to make the decisions himself. And if he makes a decision that goes bad, or he makes a decision that's different from what the players did, he can get an immediate feedback of explanation. I've talked about this for a while, but I haven't ever had the opportunity to pursue it.
So the question in the back.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your discussion. My name is Carrie Alonso, and I'm a master's student at the London School of Economics, actually. In a previous life, I supported the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's National Exercise Division. And I was intrigued by your point on needing to encourage a new generation of wargamers with fresh perspective. So I was wondering what kind of entryways you see for a new generation of professional wargamers, and what kind of entryways you'd like to see, and what innovations?
Great, that's a good question. Right now, the primary entryway that I see has been through the security consulting community, as it were, defense contractors in my language, where we have analysts who are hired to do ops analysis, systems analysis, and then we try to subvert them and turn them into wargamers. The second opportunity is through an academic environment, such as here at King's, where there are courses that you can take that give you firsthand experience at the problems of creating games, and also at the opportunities that games give you to learn new things in new ways. And unfortunately, there's not enough of those programs. Some of us in the US have been trying to get some academic programs going in wargaming specifically, as opposed to the general topic of gaming, which tends towards computer games and entertainment games. But we haven't had a lot of traction yet on that. But that's going to be the third, I think the third option, is something that's a broader academic basis, other than the kinds of things that Phil Sabin and Ivanka are trying to do here at King's.
Actually, let's take two at a time. So, sorry, gentleman in the front first.
Do you need me to use the mic for the tape? Because I'm pretty loud if I want to be.
We're on the record, so the microphone.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Hugh Little. I suppose my question comes from a place of some prior military experience and a bit of an experience of some of the institutional resilience to anything that smells like a game and isn't entirely based on science. I suppose one of the most effective ways of persuading a lot of the community who might be slightly cynical about the utility of war games might be to present some quantitative data that demonstrates that communities that wargame are better at decision making than communities that don't. Do you know if that sort of data exists, and if so, what depth it has?
And sorry, can we take the second question as well?
So the question about quantitative data about the effectiveness of war games, there is some quantitative studies that are often tied to forecasting, where the test was, here's a situation that was thinly disguised of a real world situation, and it was presented to experts, it was presented to non-experts, and then it was played in games. And the results have shown some strong value for the games. But it's kind of shaky, it's not really strong academic research. So one of the things that King's is trying to do is to start developing a framework for some strong academic research to back up the claims that the game community have. But I always kind of laugh at some of this, because it's like, well, look, we've run into this with games in education too. Well, you got to demonstrate that they're better than the old way. Well, demonstrate to me that the old way works, because it sure doesn't seem to be working. And so we get into, but it's a problem of established frameworks defending themselves against the new guys on the block. So it's a hard problem, and I think the only solution ultimately is either get them to play or get some academic stuff to, really strong academic rigor to back it up.
Okay. Hello there. I'm a student here at King's. I thought your talk was absolutely fascinating. And in the beginning, you talked about how some of the early war games became too complicated. So I just wanted to ask you if you have some methodology for finding the equilibrium between playability and reality.
Well, there is a methodology. And it was coined by one of my colleagues at CNA, called Mike Markowitz. And Mike said that the process of designing a war game consisted of a cycle between proliferation of complexity and ruthless simplification. And you just keep doing that until you have to stop. But that's essentially it. You've got to try to get things, you focus in on what's critical for the task you're trying to pursue, and then you try to ruthlessly strip away anything that doesn't really have a significant effect on that. Now, all of those are weasel words, right? What is significant, what is critical, that's the only thing we've got. Nobody's come up with, that I'm aware of a nice algorithm that you can just plug into the computer and generate the perfect game. So you got to be good. That's why they pay us the big bucks. The reason I'm bouncing around, by the way, is I'm blinded by the light.
Hello, I'm Yuji DeVell, working in actually a consultancy out in the city. So kind of horizontally getting into the field. And interesting thing about wargaming is that we're looking into how we could produce a product for our clients for cybersecurity. And what we notice is that there are vastly different types of games in the public sector and in the private sector, and both are developing sort of in parallel. Perhaps that's due to the fact that the interests, the processes, the ways of thinking are completely different. I was looking for a solution, or perhaps a way of going about creating cross-functional or cross-domain games that involve the stakeholders in both public and private, because that's the reality of cybersecurity, right?
It's interesting. We were just talking about that earlier today. The fundamental processes of war games, defense games, security games, policy games, whatever you want, and games on economics or on medicine or other things, the fundamental processes and concepts are the same. The problem is that those communities don't communicate regularly, right? And so one of the things that would be helpful is if we could set up some sort of a mechanism for people to exchange information. Maybe online, maybe a blog, maybe some sort of a bulletin board. Lots of things have been tried, but it's really, at the moment, it comes down to personal contacts. Who do you know? Look things up on the internet. Who are the people that have written about this stuff? There are books on business war games. My friend Mark Herman wrote a book called Wargaming for Leaders, in which he talked about both defense games and business games that he ran at Booz Allen Hamilton. Sorry, CNA, not really a competitor. But that's a good way to try to get things started, is see what people are out there and what they've done.
Cheers.
A gentleman in the red.
Pass the microphone.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Sir Jeremy, over there.
Jeremy Blackham, former naval person and now a miscellany of things. I find myself agreeing with everything you say. You'll be not surprised to hear. I myself have found wargaming to be particularly valuable in the field of procurement. But where I have difficulty, and I'm hoping for enlightenment, is the translation of wargaming into the strategic realm, where decision makers, real decision makers, that is in the real world, are subjected to an enormous range of pressures. I mean, you've only got to look around Europe now to see we're in a time of enormous demographic, social, and political change, and even a looming crisis, let's say. The current Ukrainian one is only one of many problems which political leaders are trying to deal with. How if we're to look at sensible outcomes and sensible procedures and tactics, are we to try and replicate pressures on real leaders and politicians which with the best will in the world, no member of a wargaming team is likely to feel.
You're not. You're not going to replicate those pressures. Just like you can't replicate the pressures of real combat in a ground combat board game. Can't be done. What you can do is you can make them sit through a reduced presentation of the problem. And in the process of dealing with that reduced presentation of the problem, what you really need is you need somebody whom they respect to observe their decision making, and then to take them back through it and help them criticize their own processes, not the decisions, but the processes. How did you think about the problem? What were the information that you wanted that you couldn't get? And what was the information that you needed that you didn't realize you needed? That's the kind of thing. Dorner's book, The Logic of Failure, is an immensely important piece of work. And he talks about the notion of how you can use, in his case he was talking about computer simulations, but it's the same with war games, or games of any sort. How you can use them to teach people to think better by getting them to understand how they think. So I think that's the best you can do, because you can't replicate. There was a British, I don't know if it was BBC. There was a television program about a crisis in, I think it was in Eastern Europe and Russia. I don't remember. It wasn't Ukraine, I'm pretty sure. But that ended up with a rapid escalation to the threat of strategic nuclear use. And the participants of that game, they were showing their attempt to represent the stresses and the pressures. And it was interesting television to watch, but it wasn't real, right? I mean, I've played nuclear games. Actually, the one game that I remember that had the most effect on me was a global war game that was held at the Naval War College back in the 80s. And in this game, it was a 3-week-long game. And at the end of every week, on the Friday afternoon, there was kind of a wrap-up presentation. Well, things had not been going well for Blue. And on this day, the word kind of trickled out to us, the analysts who were wandering around, that something was up. So we all showed up in strength at the presentation in a room kind of like this. And we sat down, and the game director came up and said, now we're going to have a speech by the President of the United States. They didn't actually play the music, but they should have. So the president player walked up to the podium and he said, the situation on the Central Front is grim. I've been advised that the Soviets have effectively used chemical weapons against all our air bases. And our air power is essentially out of the war for the next several days, by which time we expect that they will have overrun Germany. It is therefore with the greatest reluctance that I have authorized nuclear release. The room was so silent, it was eerie. It was almost real. It was scary real. It can happen, but it's rare. But something like that has an effect on people, and it has certainly affected me.
This time, gentleman in the red over here.
David Calder, I'm a research student at the Defence Academy. I'm looking at the relationship between science fiction and the military, and would just be looking for some advice on scenario writing and what's the best way to get that done.
And I'm sorry, can we take a second question as well?
Scenario writing. Yeah, well, that's a really good question. It's of course fundamentally important that the scenario sets the players up to address the questions you want them to address. And writing scenarios, writing good scenarios, really is one of the true art forms in wargame design. That you're writing a fictional story, but the story has to be real enough that the players will believe it enough to play the game. What's important in the game is that the players internalize that story and behave as if it was real. They know it's not real, but if it's a good story and it's a good game, their bodies have to do things that tell their minds that it is real. And so you get this little back and forth between, oh man, I really got to do this. Oh, it's just a game. No, I really got to do it. It's a hard thing to do. But you got to focus, as with most good, even nonfiction writing, you need to focus on conflict. What's the conflict? What's the driving element here? That because it's conflict that gets people going. The Naval War College used to get really irritated because they could never get a war started between the Soviets and the West. And the war game department guys would say, why can't we just say blue and red are pissed at each other and they're going to have a war? Well, it doesn't work that way. You know, you can do that if you're playing a game on the table, but you can't do that with serious people for serious reasons.
Thank you very much. Mark Bailey in the War Studies Department. You haven't mentioned, but I'm sure you don't dismiss, the role of historians in your complexity. And in the last question, you've already responded in some ways, in finding the complexity of the problem and simplifying it to its most important things. The historian is like the criminal investigator, finding all the evidence and the bits of evidence you haven't seen and the bits that were around the corner and the bits you haven't thought of, which fits your thing. So I hope historians do have a role in your picture and building your pictures, and I love your Clausewitzian triple trinity of spinning inferences.
Thank you. Yes, historians, okay, I grew up playing hobby war games. And hobby war games were, at that time especially, 98% historical. And so the games drove reading history, which drove playing more games, which drove reading history. And so that historical cycle was a critical thing. And one of the gurus of commercial board games, Jim Dunnigan, made a statement that remains a critical one for all of the US gamers, and that is, if you can't create a game that predicts the past, how can you create a game to predict the future? And so the historical foundation is critical for everything that we do. And it's important to understand what's real history and what's not so real history. I just had the opportunity to read a book that my friend and UK publisher John Curry encouraged me to read, called The Stress of Battle. And in the process of reading that, I learned a lot of things I didn't know. And the important thing about it was the historical evidence processed through operations research and analytical techniques created information that was contrary, almost 180 degrees out from received wargamer wisdom. And so now my great goal is to try to take some of that stuff and create a game to teach people what was really the case, not what they thought was the case. So yeah, historical stuff is important.
Gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Hadrian Saperstein. I'm a postgraduate student at King's College in the Department of War Studies. And my question is essentially geared to Mick Master and Dr. Tomes at George Mason's University's criticism of war games, and particularly in the post-Iraq Civil War period, 2008 to 2012. And their criticism essentially was that the second offstretch strategy led to procurement packages in the 90s, which made the U.S. military unprepared for what happened in Iraq. My question is, for this third offset strategy, how does wargaming prevent this screw-up, essentially? Thank you.
Yes, I I was involved in some of the post-Iraq debates and discussions. And one of the things that was clear to me was they hadn't really done good gaming. And the reason, one of the facts that made that clear was Abu Ghraib. Nobody had foreseen Abu Ghraib. Well, my friend Ed McGrady and I, we looked at each other and it was like, well, how in the heck could that be? Because any commercial hobby gamer worth his salt would have come up with something just like that as a disaster waiting to happen. And so the problem becomes, how do you use games? And how do you create games? And how do you think about the creating of the games so that it's not going to test your beliefs and prove they're correct, but it's going to find somebody that's going to break them? That's the whole point. You don't want to game to say, yay, the plan is great and we're good to go. That's what in many ways, the military staff planning system is designed to do. There's a wargaming step. But very often it's really just, here's the plan, here's what we think the enemy's going to do, and the plan is designed to defeat that. So does it defeat the enemy? Yes, great. When you get nasty wargamers, they will do things that you did not expect. And they will really try to beat you. We did some gaming for the Office of Net Assessment. And they came to CNA and to me and Ed McGrady, and they said, we need you guys to design a game, but we need you to recruit some gamers to play the bad guys. Because all of the gamers we usually use, they just turn over and let blue win. We want somebody that will play to win for the red side. So can you do that? Well, we managed to avoid rubbing our hands together and chortling in glee, but we said, of course we can do that, and we did. And they did. They kicked the crap out of the blue side. Fortunately, the blue side has learned over time that this isn't their grandfather's war game. This is not an easy task. So the problem isn't the gaming, the problem is the gamers. Who designed them, who did them, and what was the goal? If you're really trying to learn how to lose, we can teach you. But you have to want to know.
Question, gentleman in the middle.
Hi, I'm a student here at King's, actually doing Professor Sabin's conflict simulation course. My question is focused on how war games can take you down paths which are somewhat irrelevant or perhaps even crazy. There's an anecdote that I've heard described to Margaret Thatcher where she was doing a grand strategy game and it led to her invading Cuba as Britain. And so my question is, what is the danger of war games either leading you down courses that you would never pursue, or resulting in you considering paths of action and then being led into the belief that you know exactly what's going to happen?
Well, if a war game doesn't lead you down a path you didn't expect, it's probably a waste of time. On the other hand, if you believe that because somebody did something that crazy in a war game that that's what they would do in the real world, that's not true. Okay, so the trick is to understand not what happened in the game, but why it happened. What was the reasoning that led that? Can I trace that decision process from the inputs through the steps to the outputs and then figure out where was it wrong? John Curry has done a study of particularly U.S. Navy games between the wars. And those games have been, how shall I put it, praised as being very prescient. about the way the war in the Pacific went in World War II? Well, yes and no. A lot of the games were really way off as far as details go. But why they were important was they got the participants who would become the leaders of the U.S. Navy during the war. They taught them how to think operationally, how to write orders, how to do tactical thinking, and how to observe the information that they would need to make better decisions during the actual war. So at the beginning of the period in particular, the U.S. Navy's plan was to take the battle fleet out of Pearl Harbor and drive straight across the Pacific and crush the Japanese fleet and prevent them from taking the Philippines and win the war in an afternoon like Jutland. But eventually, the thinking evolved in different directions. And they evolved in directions that would ultimately become parts of the ultimate plan that the U.S. Navy followed. So all paths are worth exploring as long as you understand why they went that way.
Yeah. Brian from UCL. So I've got two questions. The first is there a difference between tabletop exercises and war games? And if there's a gold standard for wargaming that you would recommend? Thanks.
Well, it's hard to answer the first question because it depends on what, in particular, the tabletop games or the tabletop exercise and the war game is. But the key thing is that in many cases they're the same. The real focus is on decision making. Often tabletop exercises are called that so that they can avoid using that dirty word game. But they're very similar, if not exactly the same. As for a gold standard for a war game, I don't think I want to try to define a gold standard for a war game. What I like to say is that the game's design has to focus on who are the players, what decisions do they need to make to learn what you need to make to learn, what information do you need to give them so that they can make those decisions, and then how are you going to represent the results of those decisions and the interaction between the two sides. And if you can answer those questions with a strong, rigorous set of answers, that's pretty much the gold standard.
And we'll take the last question from the floor.
Dr. Perla, good evening. Thank you very much for a most entertaining lecture. Alan Jenkins, ex-Air Force and currently a cybersecurity consultant. My question is around applicability of wargaming into the fifth domain of cyber. Given that we don't have the historical background, is that a limitation? And what can we do to remove that limitation such that we can fight the next war better?
I almost got out of here.
And if I might add to that question.
Oh, great, thanks.
So the focus of our work here at King's is trying to understand the changing strategic environment. So do you see changes to the strategic environment that cause a change in the way that we've been doing wargaming?
Okay. They're obviously connected issues. Cyber war games are a pain. There are easy ways of doing cyber war games, and that's where you put your decision making. If you set the game at a high policy level, you can do a cyber policy war game relatively easily because it's just a bunch of policy geeks, or God help us, government officials, making decisions to deal with cyber attacks, say. I've been involved in some of those. They don't look much different from a classic war game, nuclear game. But as you get deeper into the technical side, now you've got a different problem. At the very lowest level, in the US at least, there are what's called cyber ranges. So if you think about tactical, operational, and strategic levels of war, the tactical level cyber is typically played in the US on cyber ranges, where they really get into the bits and bytes of the network and the wiring and the software, the firewalls, and all that stuff. So that's really hard, but it's technical. And so they do it technically. The real trick is at the operational level, I think. Because at the operational level, shall we say, the commanders in contact on the ground not only need to be able to understand their own weapon systems and how they can, cyber weapon systems and how they can use them, but also what can the enemy do to us? And a lot of that depends very much on that tactical level. And it also depends on the strategic level. What will the government allow us to do? And so it's a problem. And it's not one that I've addressed myself personally, thank goodness. But I have seen some people do a little bit. It seems like there's some doable do's there. But a lot of it, at least from what I've seen, a lot of it I can't talk about because it's too highly classified. And it's not only technical, it's policy and maybe to some extent personality driven. So yes, cyber is a challenge. And it's one of the big challenges, as Ivanka has challenged me with, of dealing with this new environment. How do we deal with things that we have no experience of? Even in the interwar period between World Wars I and World War II, we had some experience of the phenomenologies. Airplanes drop bombs. Bombs hit things and go boom. Bad things happen on the ground or on the ship when that happens. The technology, the details of the technology change, and there are other things that change. But then there was radar, which nobody had experience of. How did that affect things? Was that a big effect? Yeah. So now we're dealing with things that we don't have a lot of practical experience of, at least in the open literature. So how do we deal with those? And the only way that we can deal with them is to use whatever information we have and try to understand what the implications are of things like using drones to call down heavy attacks of artillery fire, missile fire, using cyber systems to turn off the power plants on ships so that for 6 hours their systems are completely down so that you have time to drop some missiles on them. Yeah, I don't have a good solution to that. But as far as the dealing with the strategic environment goes, the best thing we can do is try it out. Get people that know what they're thinking, how to think, put them in the games, and give them the free rein to come up with crazy ideas that everybody can go, oh, that will never work. Oh, wait, maybe it will.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perla, and thank you all very much for joining us this evening. We invite you to join us also for a cocktail reception at the Exchange, which is right next door, to celebrate the inauguration of the Wargaming Network. And before we thank our guest speaker, I would like to recognize our staff here at the Wargaming Network, Anna Nettleship, who is our coordinator in the back, James Smith, who is our digital media manager, Professor Phil Sabin, who is co-director of the Gaming Network, and of course, Professor Wim Bowen, without whom none of this research venture wouldn't have been possible. Thank you all very much.